I get very uncomfortable when there are people in my community are not, who are suffering because of the wrongdoings of other people. And often it's been in the course of my life, when that happens, I speak up.
Hi, I'm Olivia Cummings, and on this podcast, I'd like to introduce you to the people who inspire me in my life and work as a jeweler, designer, and the founder of Cleopatra's Bling. There was a moment in 2020 when Instagram was suddenly blanketed by black squares as social media users struggled to find a way to express that they had supported the rightful anger and calls for justice within the black community. In the years since, as the frenzied media cycle churned on, the spotlight may have shifted away from issues of radical justice and the black squares were quietly deleted, archived, or simply moved down the feed, subsumed by images of holidays, events, and new outfits. My guest, Darnell L. Moore, a writer and activist, has not stopped agitating, musing, and talking passionately to issues where race and queer issues intersect. Cleopatra's Bling acknowledges the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the country where we work and their continuing connections to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders and all Kulin Nations people, past, present, and future.
My name is Darnell Moore. My pronouns are he and him. I grew up and was raised in New Jersey, which is on the East Coast of the United States, a state that's called the Garden State that's sandwiched between New York and Pennsylvania. So I grew up pretty much maneuvering New York City and Philadelphia as the sort of major hubs in the area in which I grew up. I grew up, though, in a city that's called Camden, New Jersey, which is a post-industrial city, predominantly Black, African-American, and Latino, working poor, to a young mother and father. My mom was 16 when I was born. My father was 15. They were young. They were kids in a really big family, a family where we didn't have a lot of access to resources and money, but we had access to a lot of love and a lot of care that really, in many ways, not just compensated, but taught me so much more about the value of community and collective responsibility than would just having access to money did. So yeah, I grew up in a tight, large, close knit family on the East Coast of the U.S. in the '90s, coming up in the '90s in the age of hip hop, also in the sort of epicenter of the AIDS epidemic here in the U.S. And that's important for me because identify as a Black queer man. So a generation of folk who existed before me were really taken out. A large swath of the folk I would have learned from and grown in community with were taken out by the HIV epidemic at the time in which I was coming of age. So that's an important to name. I am a child of Camden, a child of Diane Chisholm, 16-year-old mom who has become something of a best friend to me, who taught me all that I know really about love. The child of a father, his name is Grafton. He died early, like a few years ago, who also, I learned a lot from as well.
That's amazing. So could you share a little bit about your journey and experiences that led you to become a prominent advocate for racial justice and LGBTQ plus rights?
It's interesting. I never really, at some point, I would describe myself as an activist or advocate because that's the language and term that people understood, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think you hearing the type of city I describe coming up in, becoming somebody in the world who cared about other people wasn't really like a vocational choice. It's sort of like it was a posture, an ethic, a way of life, right? Like when you see somebody who is without my Aquarius self, my the young person who was taught by a family member to take care of those that you love, who you know and don't, was really much at the heart of it. Um, I would say there are a few moments in my life that probably crystallized for me um, how important it was to fight for racial justice, how important it was to stand in and to speak up for the rights of LGBTQ people. The one story I tell is I was 13 or 14 in eighth grade. So this is depending on sort of where you're located. That's either like grammar school, elementary
Yeah.
school, you
You'd be
know,
like, eighth grade would
but
be like, you'd be like 13, 14?
primary school. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember one like Miss America or Miss USA or somebody of that ilk came to visit our school, and all of the young people were dressed in like all the boys, of course. They had the boys dressed in blue and like they dressed the girls as they identified them in white. It was just a thing. Like everybody's in red, white, and blue, all patriotic in the way that the United States would have us be
Wow.
dressed.
Yeah.
Um, and my school, as I said, was predominantly Black folk. These are non-white identified folk in the school, predominantly a lot of folk who also don't have access to money. So instead of the newspaper at the time really telling this beautiful story about how the young people sort of galvanized, pulled themselves, got together and invited this star into the school, it was a story pretty much about, and I remember reading this as a kid, like it talked about us as young people lacking like virtue, and it talked about the dilapidated buildings. It was, talk about like the sort of type of way that this person was doing a favor to us as young students of color, are showing up as a savior as opposed to talking about us as young, budding children with potential. I'll skip through the point to say, in response to that, I ended up writing a poem that was like probably radicalized, politicized, whatever you want to call it. It was like a poem where, for the first time, I was writing about my pride of Blackness, the pride that I felt in my people, in my senses of self. And I don't even know where this came from. But like 13, 14, I'm writing this, and it's all about like the love of sort of like of myself, the love of Black people, the love of Blackness. And I ended up winning the citywide poetry contest because of that
Amazing.
poem. So when I think about the question that you asked, so much of it was like I didn't make these calculated decisions at points, right, to sort of raise my voice. It was like growing up, being in the world, and in real time responding to injustices as they were appearing before me. That's what I would see as my sort of entry point. And what that means for me is I get very uncomfortable when there are people in my community are not, who are suffering because of the wrongdoings of other people. And often it's been in the course of my life, when that happens, I speak up, and not alone, not by myself, but with others who are also raising and using their voices.
Mm. So it's like basically your path unfolded in front of you in a very organic way.
I mean, what do you do when, like I am a person who spent most of my life believing that my queerness was wrong. I grew up really believing that who I was as a young person who had like who was attracted to girls and boys. Like I grew up largely believing, because of what I was taught within the faith institutions I was in, because of what was reinforced within the sort of cultural and social conversations that were happening, public dialogue. I hated myself. I hated who I was. I was forced to believe, because I was told so, um, that real boys, real men, real boys becoming men are not boys who are attracted to other boys. When you grow up living under those conditions, and unfortunately, what that meant for me is that turned into a type of self-hatred that was materialized. Like I tried to take myself out of this world because of other people's um, theories, logics, theologies that were pretty much lies about who that I was led to believe were true about who I am. Me acting against that isn't me, making the decision to go out in the world. Who wants to go out every day? And I wasn't trying to walk outside with a gay flag, saying, "Hey, everybody, look at me, hear what I got to say." I was literally trying to live. That was my response to people not allowing me to be my whole and full self. And I believe many people come to the work of advocacy Um, Not necessarily because you probably want to. Who wants to uh have to always fight? No one in the world that I met who are people that I look up to probably woke up and say, I want to get out here and fight hard every day over and against this whatever this thing is, right? That I'm trying to ameliorate are correct. They would rather have a world where people can be, where they can be safe, where they can exist. We know we can't have that world unless we do the work to build it. But no one really comes to advocacy like, yeah, I want to get up every day. I want to write letters to politicians. I want to disrupt violences that are being done. I want to be put on the front line and targeted possibly for my beliefs. No one really wants that. We want a world wherein that work wouldn't even need to happen because we care about each other so much that you wouldn't even need to fight to be seen or be heard.
And have you found that you've had any sort of transformational experiences with people that perhaps when you met them, had a certain viewpoint and then after discussion and meeting with people like yourself have become more open-minded or, had breakthroughs?
So let me just start with myself. So you're getting to know me a bit, and I believe that one of the best ways to help people to understand transformation is not by lecturing them or pointing the finger, but by using the self. I mean, I just explained like I was a young person coming of age in the world and coming to know myself as a gay young person, a queer young person who largely believed that homosexuality is what I'm just using that term because it's the term that was in my young mind was wrong.
Mm.
I preached it. I evangelized this. Like I held this in as a belief, right? Like I ultimately believed that that was wrong for a substantial part of my young adult life. One, because I was taught that. Two, because it was reinforced by a variety of institutions in which I was coming up, right? You hear it in school, you hear it in church, you hear it on TV, you hear politicians. I came of age when AIDS was understood as a consequence or a sin, like a response, a moral response, or a response to people's, amoral decisions, right? Um, so I use myself as an example. I am now on the other side of what I understand to be like transformation. And I have to think that way because, for instance, it took me a long time to understand the difference between gender and sexuality, as an example. I had a friend in high school who came to me one time and said, I no longer want to be called he. I'm no longer want to be referred to as a he. Like I want you to refer to me as a girl. In my mind, even as a young queer person, right, I did not even have the consciousness around any of that. So as a person who understands my work also as education, so many people that I've come across, I'm like, the reason why I can sort of meet you with a sort of type of grace and expectation for transformation is because I know real shit. Like, that was me. That's all of us. You find me one person in the world who can avoid socialization in such a way that they are free of thinking that racial differences are at the heart of how we ought to understand power, how at the heart of how we ought to understand intelligence, who gets access to safety and resources, that gender and things like masculinity and manhood are not so real as such that they can dictate how we ought to be in relationship with one another. All of us breathe all of these ideas in like air. All of us then are put on journeys to sort of overcome and relearn those ideas. And I met many people who have been brave enough to accept that, starting with myself, right?
Yeah.
Along the way. But you have to accept and be willing to sort of lean into the discomfort of unlearning in order to get free from it.
So what do you think are then, off the back of that, what do you think are the most pressing social issues today that we need to address in order to be able to have these transformations you speak of?
Oh gosh.
I mean,
Um,
dot point or choose
so
how you want to answer.
the way that I would answer that, and this is not me trying to escape the question, but and you can press back if you think that I'm bullshitting, but I think we and this is something I've learned from the from teaching from Black feminists and Black feminist thought, Black feminist organizing. We hear words like intersectionality, a term that Kimberly Crenshaw um, provided us with, and she's a Black critical race theorist, feminist. Um, but the idea, what Black feminists taught me is this: like, none of these issues are disparate, that is, disconnected from one another. In other words, we can't talk about, say, the overwhelming, disruptive capacity of, say, male dominance and control and patriarchy without talking about its connections to, let's just say, I don't know, notions of the ways we come to think about traditional family and or race and
Mm-hmm.
or like all of the, and
Climate
it's
change.
not even a cop, like everything sort of
Mm,
is interconnected, right?
100%.
um when we think about something like manhood and the way that we think about manhood and who gets to be understood as real men, who gets to be understood as real human, has everything to do with race, has everything to do with class. Like, all of those things go together. So in that way, I have always been of the opinion that solving for or trying to both build and reimagine a new world requires of us to, one, see the way that all of these investments, these investments in these ideas of power, in all of these identity constructions, and all of these um, in all of these forces that we're trying to sort of move against that are impacting people, they are tightly knitted together. And if they're tightly knitted together, then they need a response that is also integrated. Can't talk about indigeneity uh, and sort of people's understanding and relationship to land. That's a climate justice issue. That's an issue of, like, colonization. That's an issue. I mean, I can go down the line here. But then that's all. But then I think the question is, well, shit, that's a lot to deal with, right? Like, I think it's always a lot to deal with. I think the tactical approach, though, of imagining all of these things as interconnected is what might allow for us to dream and build ways of moving against, or not even just against, but reimagining what needs to go into place of the things that have harmed us as a people, as collective people.
Mm, yeah. So I guess curious to know how you think we can start such a chain effect, like a domino effect.
Yeah.
How you envision or dream that.
So a simple a story I would tell, like, I once, here in New York, when I was living there, I was at the Pride March, a Pride event, and this is right. You all, the listeners, may be familiar with um, Black Lives Matter movement, or what's really the movement for Black Lives, right? So I'm at this Pride event. Of course, I'm there, and I'm just happily gay and just out and about and having a great time on a really Christopher Street, which is actually the area where the Stonewall riots, which you may have also heard about, occurred in history. So this is an area that pride is sort of like birth within the context of the US. And the pride that's birthed there isn't just like the fantastical parade where you're wearing your nice clothes and the glitter and we're having a good time. The pride riots were actually started off as protests. These were protests in regards to how um, LGBTQI people, particularly trans women, non-binary folk, were being treated within the bars and restaurants, and just in many of the establishments, the businesses that they frequented in New York. And they were harassed, harangued, and violated by police. So that's how Pride starts. On those same streets, years later, I'm out having fun, and the Pride parade is sort of stopped, halted for a minute by Black Lives Matter protesters who are also queer and trans and gay and lesbian folk who are at the Pride parade. And the Pride parade folk, many of them started booing.
Oh,
And I said, huh,
wait. They're booing
this
the
is
Black
interesting.
Lives Matter people.
And
Oh, that's so
I'm like,
surprising.
This is so ironic. How like bananas is it that
Yeah.
we have pride. Pride exists because it began as a protest that catalyzed exactly the moment that we're sitting in now on the very streets in which people were protesting and on those streets with holding pride events for their life, like right. And how easily do we forget? So on one hand, I sat down and I said, this is a reminder for us as LGBTQ folk who can wave the rainbow flag to forget that some of us here at this Pride March are also Black and are really calling out racism and anti-Blackness. Some folk here are trans women who are asking of their cisgender counterparts to really think about the need for safety for them. Some of the people here are disabled at this Pride March. And have we thought about the fact that not everybody can actually quote unquote march? How we made provisions for those who are in wheelchairs, for those who can't see, for those who can't hear. And in the same breath, right? Like the same can be said of any movement. I'm giving this story to say, to your point, tactically, what that looks like for me is that we never show up to any quote unquote parade, whether that's Black Lives Matter, whether that's Pride, whether that's climate justice, only invested in the one thing, that one area that we think is the most compelling to us, that we always have to carry those along. Not only the people, but the issues, right? The solves for those other things that are also at the heart of the matter too. Practically, that looks like, and the way I say it is like, don't just go to your parade. Don't just go to your parade. I'd love to see other folk at the Pride Parade. But some of us in that Pride Parade would love to see you come over here and join, the parade and I'm using this as a metaphor, that's speaking up against young cis or trans women being raped or sexually assaulted, right? Because some of those folk are also girls and women. So tactically, it looks like for me making space in our hearts, in our visions that are big enough for people to hold the multiple complexities of how all these issues are connected, and us not being single variable
Mm.
advocates.
Yeah, everything touches everything. When you spoke about the way that we need also like to appreciate
Indigeneity.
indigeneity.
Yeah.
So recently I went into a very rural community here in Australia called East Arnhem Land, where you can either drive in 8 hours by a four-wheel drive through rivers
Mm.
where there are saltwater crocodiles, and they fly in every 2 weeks to this Indigenous community provisions and food.
Mm.
And they've approached me to do a jewellery collaboration with them, which I'm incredibly excited about. And it's like one of the first in Australia of this nature. And anyway, so we were there for a week working with them, but we were lucky enough to witness sort of the way that they work with the land, which
Yes.
obviously is like the way it is intended here in Australia because of the climates and everything. And white people came here and just destroyed everything and have no idea how to treat the land.
Mm.
And that's why climate change is affecting Australia so terribly with the bushfires and the flooding and everything. And, white people came here and put houses where they're not supposed to be based on, the land. So we had 8 and 6-year-old little boys showing us how to burn off the undergrowth. And they were
Yep.
running around in, we were driving around in this van to go to this sacred waterhole and to look at the cave art. And they would stop the car, they would say, stop. And then they'd stop the car, they'd jump out and go just throw a match and start a fire. So the whole like backdrop of this place we were staying was smoking the whole time. Because it was just they'd started the backfires because it was the right season before the hotter season comes in, because it's winter here in Australia. And I just was watching them and I was like, if only the government were here seeing this, because it could save thousands of people's houses and lives every year when we have the burning season and like the floods. And they knew that. And they don't have just 4 seasons, summer, autumn,
Yeah.
winter, spring. They have like 8 seasons and they've got intuition, and they literally look at one tree, and if that tree's in flower, it means there's this trigger effect and sort of dominoes effect of what that means in terms of the food that's available, the fish that are available to hunt, the certain animals that are doing whatever they're
Mhm.
doing that affects the land, and just this sort of wholeness about the way they approach the earth. I just found so inspiring, and also made me realize even more just how much they should be leading. Like in
Mhm.
Australia, I can't speak for the rest of the world how it works, but in Australia, the Indigenous First Nations people should be the ones leading, climate change disaster.
I love this. I love this, the illustration, because, what you just named, that one visit illustrated to you the connection between First Nations people, climate justice, probably like so much like access to sort of like a variety of different institutions. I mean, it's all, but that's the point, right? Like, so if I were a climate justice advocate in Australia, as an example, like I would too. Like I would say, how can we even go about this work without ensuring not only that we are doing it with First Nations people and that they're leading it, but like I can't fight for climate justice unless I'm also fighting for the rights and opportunities and resources of First Nations peoples themselves, right?
Exactly, because
That's a perfect illustration
the
of
fact that
what
their voice is not heard is just an
exactly.
example of the systemic issues. I was just thinking about it. I was like, it's ironic we've got these, white guys in parliament who are maybe scientists talking about it. It's like this 8-year-old could tell you
Absolutely.
more. Like, just go, I have his details. I'll take you to him, put him in parliament.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what you made me think of.
I appreciate that.
And I wanted to share that because I think it's probably the same in the US and, parts of
The same
Central
in a lot of
America.
places. I was on the board of an organization out out of the the Caribbean that was called the Tobago Center for the Study and Practice of Indigenous Spiritualities. That was founded by a wonderful scholar, Jackie Alexander, who's a transnational feminist who did a lot of her academic work in Canada. And one of the things that she fought so much for, that I thought was just so remarkable, was what she would call, like these indigenous knowledges of like things like the land, and how so much of the land, one, fighting for land rights, and then not only really trying to push against pharmaceutical companies who were, in some cases within a lot of the Caribbean islands, pillaging the land for use of the sort of agriculture, like the flowers and things like that, and for use of medicines. She's like, not only are you ridding the land of its riches in terms of its fruit and in terms of the sort of agriculture, but we also get rid of the knowledges that have been held by generations of people who tended these lands, who cared for it. Those knowledges are also important. The knowledge of the flower life, right? Like, so again, part of this is so interesting because even in that example, so much of the work that she was doing was, all of this ethnography work, and interviews with the people who were the keepers of those knowledges, and many of them were women.
Mm,
So here again is
yeah.
another another way of
Yeah, it
looking. This is what I
touches,
mean.
yeah,
These
then it
connections. You
touches
know what I
on
mean?
feminism and exactly, yeah. And interestingly, so we met a lot of women in this community who were sort of pioneering this whole, movement of, teaching the youth, because the elders are more, like, a lot of them are men. But I was actually astounded because most of the people that were really focused on passing down this knowledge in this specific community, in East Arnhem Land, Guapamanamu is what it's called, they were women.
Mm,
And also the thing is, I think that when, I don't know what it's like in the US, but in Australia, there's this huge fear of appropriation, and sort of
mm,
it's become sort of part of the daily vernacular here, specifically in Melbourne, I think, where I'm living. But I think the problem is with that is that it's pushing people further away from each other because there's a fear of approaching the quote unquote other. And so
Yeah.
what I've noticed is a lot of people said to me, "Oh, like be careful, like the way, careful what you put on social media. People may misunderstand what you're doing." And I was like, that's the exact problem. Like posting
Mm,
a photo on Instagram of an Indigenous boy, and then having people sort of push back and be, like, oh, this is appropriation, or, what you're doing is appropriation, is part of the problem in Australia because people are no longer intermingling. It's a new term I've
mm,
just made up. And I think it means that, for example, people won't have these experiences because they're not going out there and like meeting these people. They weren't scared of us appropriating. They were telling us everything. They wanted us there. They wanted to tell us. They call it the dream time, which is their belief system, which is, all the spirits and the stories they tell and their incredibly spiritual connection to the earth. When we got there, they took us to the waterhole, gave us they call out to the ancestors and they put water on your head and they let the ancestors know you've arrived and to look after us and that we're welcome there. So it's incredibly spiritual and touching. And I think, yeah, from the outside, if you just looked in from like a modern, woke Melbourne
mm.
perspective, people could think, what the hell are those people doing there? But if you think about it, the fact that we went there and spoke with them created such a bridge between us. And I think if more, white Australians went out there and experienced that, they would be incredibly humbled and their worlds would be opened up, and then they would look around them and think, yeah, this is how we should be leading this nation, you know?
I do. I mean, part of it for me, I think about maybe another way of talking about appropriation. I would rather talk about what an ethics of care looks like,
Mm-hmm.
right? And for me, any form of engagement or um, connections that we make, community inroads and building bridges should be grounded in like an ethics, i.e., like a sense of just approaches to forging those connections. In other words, you don't just show up in somebody's community or home without an invitation. So, have I sought an invitation? Have I been welcomed? You understand? Like, and if I've been welcomed and I gracefully asked, may I join your community? May I come to learn? And I received an invitation. That's an ethic of that. That to me is one of a principle that you need to apply, right? Which is different than flying in, and I'm using this metaphorically, into somebody's community like you're the savior in a helicopter. You understand? That's you're coming in, and like I once went on a trip, and we were in South Africa in Guguletu in a township, and the people that I was with, we were all from the university. I'm like, at some point I stopped and I said, wait, why are we here? Like we are investigating. People had cameras out, like they're taking pictures of people's home. And I said, stop. We are visitors here. We are visitors here in this township, which may look very different from the world you come from. But your pictures that you're taking so that you could have sort of like a memory, an archival memory of what you might understand to be difference is someone's actual daily lived fleshly material experience. Do not take pictures when we have been invited as guests, right? That's an ethic. Like me going into a space and learning from First Nations people practices that they've been doing for thousands of years, right? And then taking those practices, one, without attributing them to the folk with whom I learned it from. And even, going out and I talked about pharma companies and these like making profit in a way that disenfranchises the very people that we got those knowledges from. That and being thoughtful about that's an ethic. So for me, it is, bridge building needs to happen. We got to make sure that we are not talking to people who look um like us, who come from places where we're all talking the same. We all look the same. There's nothing. We're like that's a boring existence. There isn't. I don't see. And not to take into these. These big bridge building relationships with a deficit model. this is not like someone coming to sort of like First Nations community saying, "Oh my gosh, I
Poor
have like
things.
I
Yeah.
with so much to teach you."
Mm.
No, there is so much for us to learn. Our planet is what it is because of the sustenance and maintenance of our planet by so many communities. So to your point, your first point about us being humbled, it isn't humble because of we're coming into an encounter with, let's just say, abject poverty or difference of living. No, often is the case that even amid the lack of, you find you're in communities with people who just know so much damn more than you ever would.
Oh, it's,
You know what I mean?
yeah,
That
definitely.
for me is like those are like what I would understand to be the ethics that should undergird how we connect, which can which if we think that way, right, can ensure like protect us against appropriating anything.
Definitely. So I want to go back to your work and talk about your book, No Ashes in the Fire, and how you discuss resilience and overcoming adversity.
Mm.
Can you pinpoint a few moments in your life where you felt that you had to really call on your strength to persevere?
Oh my gosh, so many.
So many.
So many. Um, you know, I described one of them, and that is learning to love myself through a self-hatred that was driven by socialization. In other words, like, like I was discovering myself as queer, and so much of what I knew to be true about that was like everything I was told was about it was wrong. Um, in the book, I talk about queerness. I talk about it as magic. Possibly, I'm like, what? Because when I think about this, let's not even call it strength. The power, the force that one must call upon to, let's say, not only love but invent, create a self that is in the most, and I'm saying using this in the best way possible, antagonistic to what everyone else tells you you ought to be. That takes, and what I mean by that is like when the whole world is saying no, gay is wrong. That's a message, and you somehow like conjure the strength, the ingenuity, like to become a self, to become a self that loves itself, but is vibrant and alive. What a magical force! Now, here's the thing that I always also say about, and this is probably my point about resilience. So there's that. I grew up, and I'll get back to the point about resilience, but I grew up in a home where I'm very passionate about women's safety and gender equity and feminism. To be quite frank, because I grew up in a home where with a lot of women, majority women, and most of those women were either abused by their male partners physically and or they were pillaged by the state. You know what I'm saying? Like underpaid, overworked. And this is true not just in New Jersey where I grew up, but in a lot of places, that the invisible labor done in the home and outside the home is a domain of the woman, and she's not paid for it, and not, so I can go on and on. And I watched my mom suffer physical abuse at the hands of my father. That had a wild impact on me, right? But here's the thing about resilience. I like to say I am not a like when my book came out, there's like people are like, oh, you just went through so much. What did you do? Like tell us your secret. And I'm like, I am not special in that way. So many of us have had to call upon our strengths to be here today, and some of us, and I mean that literally. What I'll say about resilience is, and I got this from another Black woman anthropologist and friend, Amy Meredith Cox. The problem with resilience, she says, is that resilience is often understood as a person who is constantly kicked down, ability to get back up, which often means for the person that's doing the kick and keep going, because they'll find a way to get back up. So part of what I like to say then is resilience. Yes, I've used it. I've had to lean into my own strength. I wish of a world where we there's a saying like in the United States there was a saying that black girl magic, right? Like
I've heard that a
this
lot. Yeah.
right this saying, and I love it, right? And I also queer magic. I talked about queer magic. I also want to live in a world where, say, a queer or young trans person did not have to fight so hard. They shouldn't have to pull out their wands all the time, right? And to sort of like use the wands to protect themselves against laws that are trying to legislate their use of the bathroom, laws that are trying to legislate representations of queer and trans people in the books that they get access to at school. This is happening in the States right now, right? Like Black Girl Magic, love that. But I also want my mom and my Black sisters and all the other Black girls in the world to not have to be so damn magical all the time. Magic is great, but guess what else? Stopping sexual assault is even better. Magic is amazing. Oh, yes, love magic, but making sure that you don't beat the hell out of a young queer person on the street just because of the way that they are that the way that you might sort of might be expressing themselves is much more valuable to me. Like First Nations magic and power, absolutely. But guess what? When we stop pillaging First Nation people's land and honoring the things and the promises, and not and even the non-promises that have been made around reparations and so forth, right? Like those things to me feel much more of the talk. I would rather talk about that than the need for those who have always had to pull on their own strength and must always continue to do so in order to be alive. Like at some point, I just wanted to be a little kid who enjoyed, playing on the bike and like having fun outside and dancing with my sisters, maybe being attracted to a girl or a boy. Like at some point, I should not have had to fight so fucking hard. Excuse my language. Sorry, sorry.
No, go for
Edit
it.
that out.
We won't
you
edit
know,
that out. No, we love it.
but at some point, like
Yeah.
people who have had to fight so hard should not have to.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So
100%.
like
To also what I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, is that they shouldn't always have to take the higher road. It should
should not have to take the higher road, should not have to take the hits. Like people give you awards for being resilient. And I'm like, what if you invested you awarded me for overcoming, let's
yeah.
just say like real time hate
Yeah.
that was coming from people and institutions because I was a queer person. What if
Mm.
you took that energy and actually went back to those institutions and said, stop treating young people this way?
Yeah. Yeah.
See the difference?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I'd be curious also if you came to Australia to see like the parallels you see between sort of white Australian society and white society in the US. I'd be really curious. My brother's lived in New York for over 10 years. I feel like, I don't know, like I can't really comment too much on the US, but I feel like there are quite a few common themes. So I'd be really curious to hear about that. But I feel like Australia could be more backward, to be honest.
I don't, I have no context, so I'm not visited, and you know, um,
We're
and
always
wouldn't be.
sensitive, more sensitive to the places we're from, though, I think, because we
Yeah,
see,
that's right.
we see the deeper
I mean,
issues. So,
what I could say is that when you think about, let's just say, white supremacy as both an idea and like, and when I say idea, I mean idea and like, um, an idea that finds itself shaping laws, shaping sort of communal relationships, shaping and determining who gets access to power or not, shaping notions of beauty. Oh, I can go down the line. That is inconsequential of where you live. You know what I'm saying? So at base, there is this idea that we all have to contend against, um, that we must attend against regardless of where we live.
and also, I guess to further what you were saying before about how everything has a ripple effect, every cause has a ripple effect. I guess it's the same as like we saw this during COVID, right? That
Yeah,
no country was an island during COVID.
that's exactly right.
And it's the same, I guess, with all of these issues. Like Australia, yeah, there are many, many systemic issues that have come from colonization here. but they're
Absolutely.
not detached from the issues that we're now seeing all around the world. And, it's easy to isolate because I feel like it feels in our minds, we can sort of decompartmentalize and think, okay, that's an Australia problem, but it's like,
Exactly right. And
you
you're
know,
like, that's not my problem. And you actually like,
yeah,
actually,
it's like actually, it doesn't stop. The problem doesn't say, oh, okay, I'm not going to cross the border.
exactly right.
It just
The problems have long, long, long crossed the border. In fact, the borders exist because of the very problems that we.
literally, like, we've still got borders like kingdoms, like thousands
Exactly.
of years ago, like when we were trading on boats, and it's wild to me.
Absolutely.
Can't believe that we still have a visa system, to be honest. It blows my mind
Mhm.
that, like, I've got a few friends in Istanbul. I lived in Istanbul for 5 years, which is where I learned how to make jewelry with the artisans of the Grand Bazaar. And I've got many, many Syrian friends there. And it just completely blows my mind that because of their passports, certain countries they can't enter. I just, I can't get my head around that. Like, because of my passport, and as an Australian, I can enter the EU for 3 months. And them, as Syrians or Palestinians, they have to do this whole visa application process to visit France. And also, I mean, I'm not going to go down this because it'll just open a whole can of worms. But what have France done for colonization? It's like it's
I mean,
bonkers.
no, look, there is no, and this is why in some places where the conversations, like, the racism that you all talk about in the context of the US, that's not the same here. And, like in certain Europe or sort of like North African. And I'm like, huh? Okay, so let's not use, maybe we won't, we can, let's agree that using sort of what we might understood as sort of generalized terms that have unique differences when using different contexts, like black as an example. Um, which is different in other contexts. We can go down the line about how localized context, social, cultural context, political context shapes how we talk about issues. But we can definitely be clear about the rootedness of them all. Like if we just talked about, if we just stopped talking about racism, patriarchy, and just say sexism overall, and talked about colonization. The moment you say colonization is a moment you're talking about racialization, male dominance,
Yeah,
and dot, dot, dot. So it's like,
common
yeah,
themes.
exactly right.
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about the notion of allyship and how it's become so much more of a mainstream term, to be an ally and what this means. And it's like kind of a complicated and fraught label now, in my opinion. And it sort of seems quite performative often on social media. So I wanted to ask you about, your feelings about the concept of white or cis straight allies and how this topic has shifted since the idea was sort of first developed.
Yeah, and there's a whole series of conversations, dialogues that have been had about allyship, performative allyship, what it really means. I mean, on some occasions, I've used the term accomplice as opposed to ally. Accomplice, I like that because it reminds me of somebody that like jumps in the fight and not just stands on the sideline. um, so I've used that term. I think the idea, though, regardless of what term we use, is it goes back to what I talked about before in ethics. Like, what are we really doing, and what do we see as our role? First of all, let me say this: um, allyship is only problematic in as much as it allows a person who sees himself as an ally as somehow not consequential to the very thing that they're trying to undo. What I mean by that, as a man, a male identified person, I don't see myself necessarily as an ally in feminism, like because patriarchy only harms women, as an example. Patriarchy harms me as a man too. You know why? Because it has me believe in a version of myself, a lie about who I am as a man, etc. Um, so like for me, I am like, if I am like a white identified person in anti-racism work, feeling like I'm only fighting to make things better for black people or brown folk, Indigenous First Nations folk. White racism isn't only bad to the non-white people, it's bad to white people too, because it has you believing in lies. It has us believing in notions of supremacy that actually harm the humanity of white people too. Does that make sense? So for me, I can't, if we're not thinking about our commitment to a shared struggle in that way, that is to say, like, I need to fight for this not on your behalf, right? Or because this is harming you, but one, this is harming you, and I know I'm a part of that in terms of holding it up if I don't have to tear it down. But that this thing that I'm trying to fight against impacts me as much as it impacts you, so we all got to fight it together. That's sort of at the heart of what this means for me. Hope that makes sense.
No, it definitely made sense. And you actually reminded me of sort of like the notions that James Baldwin touches on about like how he sort of talks about, white supremacy as not benefiting anybody. Like it's not nice to be a suppressor, and to believe in that like to have that your paradigm of your life being shaped. And that's like, who wants to suppress other people really at the core of their souls? It's just like you're taught that. And like, imagine the First Fleet who came to Australia and legitimately thought that they knew better than the Indigenous people. How is that a nice feeling?
And not only a nice feeling, like, but it's just, like the levels at which, and Toni Morrison talks about this, the levels at which it is destructive to our spirits and who we understand ourselves to be as human people. It's psychologically destructive. It has, so yeah.
Yeah. I think we should continue this discussion in Melbourne. I think you should come.
Say less. Give me a reason to come to Melbourne. I would love to visit.
Lovely to speak with you. Have a great day. And thank you for being on the podcast.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
This was the Cleopatra's Bling podcast with me, Olivia Cummings. Next time...
I know there's a lot of models that are still working, but that's also relying on the kind of work that they do to their face to still keep them young, And that's not exactly a good plan for a standard person who might not have that kind of support in their life,
Until then, stay curious.